actually explains why taking a selfie at a sacred ancient temple might literally destroy the community that built it.
Right, which sounds extreme, but it is entirely true.
Yeah, and we tend to think of our vacations as these harmless, well-deserved escapes. You want to see beautiful things, maybe learn a little history, take some photos.
Of course.
But beneath the surface of every resort, every guided tour, and like every perfectly framed sunset snapshot, there's this massive invisible collision happening.
A huge collision.
Exactly. And if you are someone who loves to travel and you consider yourself a curious learner, you are caught right in the middle of this. So today we are doing a deep dive into a stack of academic research that diagnoses the central tension in modern tourism.
It's a fascinating tension, yeah.
It really is. It is the clash between two deeply opposing forces. On one side, we have ethical responsibility, the obligation to respect local people, their history, and their reality. And on the other side, we have aesthetic staging.
Right, the demand to make things look pretty, comfortable, and visually pleasing for the visitor.
Exactly.
And to really understand how those two forces collide, we have to look closely at a word that gets thrown around a lot in the travel industry, which is authenticity.
Oh, sure. Every brochure is always promising an authentic experience.
Exactly. And the assumption there is that authenticity is just this static object. Like, we think it's a perfectly preserved ancient ruin or a local artisan weaving a basket the exact same way their ancestors did 500 years ago.
Like something you can just walk up to, point at, and say, yep, that's authentic.
Right. But the research points to something much more complicated. Authenticity isn't an object you can just go and look at. It is a highly complex psychological and social construct.
Which makes it messy.
Very messy. Over the course of this deep dive, we are going to explore how our desperate hunger to find the real thing often ends up forcing destinations to completely destroy their own reality, and hopefully how we might actually begin to fix that.
Okay, so before we figure out how a destination gets destroyed, we need to look at the mechanism of what tourists, you, me, all of us are actually seeking out. Like, why are we so obsessed with finding the authentic in the first place?
Well, it fundamentally stems from a reaction against modern life. Sociologists who study tourism, like Dean McCannell, they argue that in our highly digital, industrialized routines, we experience a profound sense of alienation.
I mean, we spend 50 weeks a year staring at screens.
Exactly. Disconnected from nature, disconnected from our physical roots, and often disconnected from deep human interaction. So we use our 2 weeks of vacation to go searching for that lost meaning. We want something raw.
But the tourism industry is a massive economic engine.
Right. And it knows that raw reality is often chaotic, unpredictable, or honestly, just kind of boring. So they build what is called staged authenticity. They construct a theater of reality.
They give us what our brains think the reality should look like rather than the unvarnished truth.
Exactly. And the research breaks this down into 3 distinct types of authenticity that our brains are trying to satisfy. The first is object-related authenticity.
Okay, so that's the straightforward physical reality.
Yes. You are standing in front of the actual original stones of the Colosseum in Rome. The physical object is genuine. But the second type is where the staging really begins, and that's constructive authenticity.
Constructive, meaning we build it.
Right. It is entirely psychological. It's not about the physical object itself at all. It's about the cultural expectations we build around it. If a destination matches our preconceived, romanticized idea of what it should look like, we label it authentic.
I see. So if I travel to Paris and I see a guy wearing a beret and a striped shirt, pedaling a vintage bicycle with a baguette in the basket, my brain immediately fires off, yes, authentic Paris.
Right, exactly.
Even if that guy is actually like a finance bro who was just late for his corporate job, the visual fulfills my constructed expectation.
And if he was just wearing sweatpants and carrying a frozen pizza, you might feel let down.
Oh, totally.
Even though that sweatpants and pizza combo is a completely authentic Parisian reality today.
That is so true.
And then the third type is existential authenticity. This shifts the focus away from the destination entirely and puts it squarely on the tourist's internal state. It's the emotional connection you feel.
So it's about me, not the place.
Exactly. When you escape your daily grind, stand on a mountain, and feel like you've connected with your true self, you deem the entire experience authentic, purely because of your own internal emotional release.
Wow. It's like going to a heavily themed immersive restaurant versus just eating a sandwich in a local's actual kitchen. We say we want the gritty reality of the local kitchen.
But we don't really.
No, because the destination knows we'd probably be in the way. And honestly, we wouldn't actually enjoy sitting on a wobbly stool next to a sink full of dirty dishes.
Right.
So they build us the themed restaurant, they put in exposed brick, they print rustic menus, they serve food on wooden planks. So we get the aesthetic feeling of the rustic kitchen without any of the actual inconvenience.
Exactly. And the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu explains the mechanics of this using the concept of cultural capital. The expectations we have for that themed restaurant are completely programmed by our education, our background, and our social class.
Wait, how does social class play into it?
Well, a tourist with high cultural capital, someone who considers themselves highly educated and well read, they might scoff at a mainstream tourist trap.
Yeah.
They will demand to go to an off the beaten path, gritty neighborhood to see the quote unquote real city.
Right, the anti-tourist tourist.
Exactly. But the trap there is that their desire for the gritty neighborhood is just a different, slightly more sophisticated expectation of a staged reality. They still want it to look a certain way. Our backgrounds dictate our aesthetic demands.
Which exposes a massive vulnerability for the people who actually live in these destinations.
Oh, absolutely.
If millions of tourists are arriving and demanding a curated, aesthetically pleasing version of reality, the local culture is forced to adapt. It essentially turns human life into a product on a shelf.
And the academic term for that is aestheticization. This is the process where deep, complex, often sacred cultural rituals are stripped of their original meaning, specifically to provide visual pleasure for visitors. The cultural element is removed from its context, decorated, and turned into a performance.
The sources outline a very specific mechanism for this. They talk about traditional dances in Bali and those African photo safaris.
Yes, those safaris are a perfect example. Tribal daily life is literally just staged as a photo op for people driving by in Jeeps.
It's wild.
Yeah.
And with the Balinese dances, originally for the local communities, those held profound religious and spiritual significance. They were performed as offerings, binding the community to their beliefs.
Right.
But because Western tourists want to see something exotic and beautiful while they drink a cocktail, those same dances have been extracted from the temples. They are choreographed, shortened to fit a dining schedule, and performed in luxury hotel lobbies.
And this is where that 14th century concept you mentioned at the beginning comes into play.
Oh,
The sociologist Ibn Khaldun developed a theory around a word called asabiya, which translates roughly to social solidarity or social cohesion. It is the invisible glue that holds a community together.
okay.
So when a Balinese dance is performed for the gods, it reinforces that asabiya. The community is bonded by a shared spiritual devotion. But the moment the dance is moved to the hotel lobby and performed for tourist dollars, the motivation entirely shifts.
Because now it's a job.
Exactly. The dancers are no longer participating in a shared spiritual exercise. They're competing with each other for tips and employment. The gaze of the tourist fundamentally alters the behavior of the community, and that social glue dissolves. The culture decays from the inside out because it's no longer functioning for itself.
Man, I understand the tragedy of a sacred dance losing its meaning, but I have to push back on the economic reality here. If a small, isolated culture is struggling to survive in the modern global economy, isn't monetizing their traditions a way to save them? I mean, isn't a staged, commercialized dance that brings in millions of dollars in infrastructure better than the culture just fading into extinction?
That is the most common defense mounted by the global tourism industry.
Because it makes sense on paper.
It does, but it completely shatters when you apply basic Kantian ethics. Immanuel Kant argued that you cannot use human beings merely as a means to an end. It becomes an ethical violation when the commercialization happens without genuine, autonomous local consent.
Consent is the key.
Right. If a community decides to share a practice, that's one thing. But often the culture is modified by outside tour operators to meet a foreign aesthetic expectation. The locals are told to exaggerate their dress, play up stereotypes, or perform at certain times just to secure funding.
Wow, so they aren't even being themselves anymore.
Exactly. That is cultural essentialism. At that point, you aren't actually preserving the culture. The philosopher Jean Baudrillard would call the resulting performance a simulacrum, a hollow, fake copy of a reality that no longer exists. The money might keep the people fed, but ethnographically, you are just preserving a ghost.
Preserving a ghost. That is a haunting way to put it. So we see the damage caused when locals build a stage to appease our demand for the aesthetic. But the stage doesn't cover everything.
No, it never does.
Eventually, a tourist decides to wander off the resort. They go looking for that off the beaten path reality. And when the stage drops and they encounter a reality that isn't aesthetically pleasing, the the reaction is rarely positive.
This introduces a fascinating psychological phenomenon known in the literature as negative authenticity.
And negative authenticity.
Yeah, this happens when a tourist actually gets exactly what they asked for, raw, unvarnished, unstaged reality, but it so completely fails to match their comfortable, curated expectations that it triggers profound psychological discomfort.
The sources show this manifesting very clearly around physical infrastructure. Let's say a traveler books a trip to a remote village, explicitly stating they want to avoid the sanitized resorts to see how people really live.
Right, they want the real deal.
But when they arrive, they find the reality includes open air sewage, unpaved roads turning to mud, or a lack of reliable drinking water. Or perhaps they encounter a local cultural practice involving animal processing that deeply offends their Western sensibilities.
And instead of feeling the joy of existential discovery, they feel revulsion.
Exactly.
The mechanism happening in the tourist's brain here is cognitive dissonance. Psychologists, like Leon Festinger, define this as the mental friction that occurs when a person holds two contradictory beliefs at the exact same time.
Okay, so what are the two beliefs here?
On one hand, the tourist fiercely holds the identity. I am a worldly, adventurous traveler who embraces authentic reality. But on the other hand, they hold the baseline demand. I require the hygiene, climate control, and safety of my upper middle class life. When those two beliefs collide in the mud of that remote village, the brain just short circuits. The friction is too intense to process.
And rather than questioning their own impossible demands, the brain resolves the friction by blaming the destination. The tourist decides the experience was quote unquote bad, when in reality, the destination was just existing ethically as itself.
Perfectly said.
It sounds like we want the gritty National Geographic aesthetic, but we demand it comes with flawless Wi-Fi, Western plumbing, and air conditioning. When it doesn't, we experience culture shock.
We demand the aesthetic of the wild, but the ethics of our own comfort.
Exactly. We realize we never actually wanted the reality. We just wanted a highly rendered simulation. But, we've been talking about discomfort mostly in terms of plumbing, infrastructure, and hygiene.
Right.
But there's a completely different kind of reality that tourists actively seek out. A reality where the discomfort isn't about the physical environment, but about immense human suffering.
Yes. This takes us into the realm of dark tourism. This involves traveling specifically to sites of tragedy, mass disaster, death, and historical atrocity. And it is at these sites where the clash between ethical responsibility and aesthetic staging reaches its absolute peak.
The research focuses heavily on the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial. And I look at a site like that and I think, well, people need to go there. We have a moral obligation to witness that history so we don't repeat it.
Yeah.
Isn't that an inherently good thing?
The intention might be educational, but the mechanism of modern tourism worked against it. Think about the impossible dilemma of managing a site like Auschwitz.
It has to be incredibly difficult.
It is. The ethical responsibility is absolute. You have to show immense, unflinching respect for the victims, honor the gravity of the Holocaust, and force humanity to confront its darkest capabilities.
Right.
But the people walking through the gates are fundamentally conditioned as modern tourists. And the primary impulse of modern tourist is visual consumption. It's the deeply ingrained urge to consume a space visually, to capture it, to document oneself inside it, or subconsciously to seek a morbid thrill.
Which explains the incredibly jarring behavior you see at these sites. People taking smiling selfies in front of a place of mass extermination.
Exactly.
It is the ultimate ethical failure of the tourist gaze. The aesthetic impulse, the need to frame a photo for social media, completely overriding basic human empathy.
The brain's conditioning to consume the vacation is so strong, it blinds them to the mass grave they're standing on.
That's just chilling.
And this forces the curators of these sites into a desperate struggle known as memory politics. How do you physically design a space of trauma for millions of visitors?
Right, because you have to accommodate the crowds.
But if you make the site too aesthetically pleasing, if you build nice paved walkways, put up slick, interactive digital displays, and perfectly landscape the grass you sanitize the history, you make the horror too easy to digest, which is an ethical failure.
But you can't just leave it as it was either, right?
No, because if you leave it entirely raw and unmitigated, you risk traumatizing the visitor to the point where their brain shuts down defensively and they learn absolutely nothing. Finding the exact physical balance between the ethical weight of the past and the aesthetic consumption of the modern visitor is agonizing.
So we have diagnosed a pretty severe systemic disease here. We've unpacked how our craving for authenticity drives the commodification of indigenous cultures. We've seen how cognitive dissonance causes us to reject the reality we claim to want, and we've explored the intense ethical failures at sites of dark tourism.
It's a lot.
It is a lot.
Yeah.
So, if the very presence of a tourist inherently forces a destination to alter its reality, is there any way to visit these places without damaging them? Like, how do we fix this?
The academic consensus points to a structural shift called participatory tourism management.
Okay, what does that look like?
The mechanism here is all about narrative control. It means completely removing the outside tour operators, the foreign corporate investors, and the hospitality conglomerates from the curation process. Instead, you empower the local populations to take total control of how their own culture is displayed.
So, they're the ones pulling the strings.
Exactly. They decide what is shared, how it is framed, and what remains fiercely private.
The research actually highlights some amazing case studies where this is working. Look at the Maori people in New Zealand.
A fantastic example.
Historically, indigenous cultures have had their stories narrated by outside tour companies, driving buses through communities and pointing out the windows. But the Maoris have increasingly taken active structural leadership in managing their own cultural tourism.
Right. They own the companies, they lead the exchanges.
This means the history is shared accurately and respectfully, entirely on their terms.
And returning to Ibn Khaldun's theory of asabiya, when the community is in charge of the presentation, they protect their social cohesion. The solidarity remains intact because they aren't performing for a corporate overlord, they are actively managing an educational exchange.
We see similar success in Canada, too, with the Whistler Village model.
Yes, that system is built on mandatory joint decision-making. Before any aesthetic development happens to appease tourists, the local citizens, the small businesses, and the government all have to sit at the same table. It acts as a structural safeguard.
To ensure the town doesn't turn into a hollow simulacrum, there is also a fascinating digital approach happening in Indonesia. Bali, which has suffered massively from over-tourism, is using digital platforms to get direct, real-time feedback from the local population.
Which is brilliant. It democratizes the impact of tourism.
Yeah. If a certain practice is becoming too commercialized, the community can flag it instantly.
So technology provides new tools for living cultures. But at the sites of immense historical trauma, the solution is deeply human. It relies on what is called ethical guiding.
Ethical guiding.
Yeah. At places like Auschwitz or Robben Island in South Africa, where Nelson Mandela was imprisoned, the tour guides undergo highly specialized, rigorous ethical training. Their function completely shifts.
They aren't just reciting dates anymore.
Exactly. They are no longer there to point out visual spectacles. Their job is to actively foster empathy. They are trained to navigate the visitor's psychological journey, purposefully disrupting the aesthetic gaze and ensuring the ethical weight of the site pierces through the tourist's defenses.
Those structural solutions make a ton of sense for the destinations. But I keep thinking about the individual traveler. It feels like participatory management and ethical guiding are just putting the burden of fixing this entirely on the people hosting us.
That's a very fair point.
So does the listener right now, the person booking their next flight, do they have to fundamentally change the mechanics of how they consume culture?
Yes, absolutely. The entire system of staged authenticity exists strictly because the global tourist demands it. The industry is just reflecting our desires. Right. If you want to stop the destruction of the places you visit, you have to shift your internal mechanics. You must transition from being a passive consumer of beautiful aesthetics to becoming an active ethical participant.
And how do we do that?
That requires you to intentionally accept discomfort. It requires you to embrace friction, to accept the lack of a perfectly curated aesthetic, and most importantly, to respect the boundaries of the reality you are stepping into. True authenticity might mean putting the camera down.
Wow. We have covered a massive amount of conceptual ground today. We started by tearing down the idea of authenticity as a physical object, exploring the psychological depths of constructive and existential authenticity.
We covered a lot, yeah.
We looked at the tragic mechanics of aestheticization, where sacred rituals dissolve into hotel entertainment. We unpacked the cognitive dissonance of negative authenticity, where our demand for comfort makes us reject the reality we asked for. And we navigated the agonizing memory politics of dark tourism.
It is a delicate, often painful web of interactions. And as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a completely different angle to think about regarding the future of travel.
Okay, let's hear it.
We spent this time discussing how our physical presence alters these destinations. But consider the rapid advancement of virtual reality.
Oh, wow. VR.
Yes, In the near future, VR will be able to perfectly synthesize that constructive authenticity we talked about. It will be able to give us the exact, hyper curated, aesthetically flawless simulation of a Parisian street or a remote jungle, all without us ever leaving our living rooms.
And without ever burdening the local infrastructure.
Exactly. So the question is, if we transition to perfect virtual simulations, will that finally save these local cultures from the destructive force of our aesthetic demands?
That's a wild thought.
Or by completely removing the friction, the discomfort, and the reality of the physical world, will we sever our last remaining connection to our shared human empathy? It's something to think about before you book your next ticket.